All right, well, here's our lecture for Wednesday. And it basically all gets to this question here: is human behavior shaped by evolution? And the chapter itself is about sociobiology and how do we deal with it? How do we think about it as interventionists? But really, the key aspect there is how does it impact human behavior? The chapter referenced a book written by E.O. Wilson, who is the father of sociobiology, and 90 plus percent of his book is about applying sociobiology or the evolution of behaviors to non-human animals, and basically makes a very compelling case that we can explain most, if not all, animal behavior by the influence of natural selections preserving that behavior. And then the last couple of chapters start applying that to humans. And that's where it gets more interesting, a lot more controversial, and a lot less clear as far as the influence that natural selection plays on preserving human behavior. So as you prepare for class on Wednesday, know that we're going to basically go through these different areas. We'll talk about kin selection in class on Wednesday, and we'll talk about other animal behaviors that are preserved by natural selection. So first question: can natural selection act on behaviors? There's no doubt that behavior is influenced by genes. We've seen this time and time again in animals, doing knockout studies where you knock out a particular gene and it influences animal behavior. Where some behaviors are preserved even if you do cross fostering studies where you take an offspring and you raise it with parents that aren't its own parent, and it illustrates some of the behaviors of its parents rather than its foster parents. So we have a great deal of evidence to support that behavior is influenced by genes. And while there may be many genes at work and the environment might have a large impact on the phenotype, whatever that particular behavior is, for many of these behaviors, we can actually explain them using microevolutionary forces. Explain them by natural selection, favoring a particular behavior and thus preserving it in a population, or maybe as drift, impacting, behaviors. And so we can explain a lot of these using microevolutionary forces. And so then it comes to this one. But what about altruism? So it's one thing to explain, a behavior that very clearly leads to increased reproductive output. But what about a behavior like altruism? So let's address that. Why do some animals behave altruistically? First, we need to define altruism. Altruism is the sacrifice of fitness or your own reproductive output for the benefit of another. And so that's what altruism means. It can be seen in a number of different ways. The text talks a lot about ground squirrels giving an alarm call, increasing their probability of being eaten by a predator. You have also from the text helpers at the nest, some individuals foregoing their own reproduction to help their parents be more successful. All right, these would all be examples of altruism. And so, in order to explain why animals can behave altruistically through sociobiology, we have to understand that total fitness, is basically a measure of your contribution to the subsequent generations. It's a combination of direct fitness, your production of viable offspring, so your children that are able to reproduce themselves, but it's also a factor of indirect fitness, which is the successful reproductive output of your relatives. And so total fitness is a combination of those two. So you benefit from your own offspring, having or forming viable offspring. You also benefit from your relatives having viable offspring. And so in this way, it makes it to where animals are more than just survival machines, and this would apply for plants as well. that they are basically reproductive machines trying to leave copies of their genes in future generations. Now, this is especially interesting if you think about natural selection acting at the level of an individual gene, which we'll see when some people in our class talk about the selfish gene. But even thinking about natural selecting acting at the level of the individual, you think about that an individual's fitness is also going to be increased by having especially close relatives reproducing. So what we find, or what we would predict, is that individuals should behave altruistically towards close relatives and not behave altruistically towards others. And we find that individuals rarely behave altruistically towards non-relatives. Some species do have a high level of altruistic behaviors, especially towards close relatives. The text talks about the ground squirrels, that the females don't disperse like the males do, and so you end up with a number of closely related females living in close proximity. And so while an individual may increase their probability of being eaten by giving the alarm call, it may lead to many of their close relatives surviving to reproduce more successfully. And we'll talk about this on Wednesday. And so how close must the relative be? And this is a very interesting question, and one that heavily influences whether or not you would predict natural selection would preserve this altruistic behavior. And again, we'll talk more about this on Wednesday. Now, there are some cases of altruism towards non-relatives, and those can usually be explained as reciprocity. Basically, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. The example given in the text is baboons often recruiting individuals to help in a physical combat, and then later you'll find the roles reversed. Another example not given in the textbook is with vampire bats, where some bats will share their blood meal with an unsuccessful vampire bat, because in the future, maybe 2 nights later, the roles will be reversed. All right, so what else can sociobiology explain? We just talked about it explaining altruistic behavior. So you have what's called the hawk and dove game. The text didn't explicitly talk about it this way, but I will on Wednesday. Basically, it boils competitive strategies down to 2 alternatives. You could, 1, behave as a hawk, and that is fight for access to those resources and being willing to fight even in the midst of incredible potential physical harm. Or you could put up a show and assess your strength compared to your competitor without the physical combat, and that's the dove strategy. And what you find is hawk strategies are very rare in animals. Most animals have ways of sizing up their competitor, through some kind of like an arm wrestling match or a tail wrestling match, or just some other, ramming their antlers into each other. That most animals employ a dove strategy. And again, we can explain this through natural selection. On Wednesday, we'll actually work through what's called the hawk and dove game, and we'll introduce a new term that wasn't introduced in this chapter called the evolutionary stable strategy. So if we're going to talk about natural selection preserving behaviors, one thing that we have to also introduce is sometimes behaviors are preserved not because they maximize fitness, but because they can't be beat by an alternative strategy, and we'll see what that looks like on Wednesday. So again, this is the whole point of this chapter. Can sociobiology explain human behavior? And I will tell you, this one is controversial regardless of the philosophical commitment of the researcher. There are a number of secular scientists that still have a number of issues with thinking about the evolutionary history of humans highly influencing our behavior. So one thing we would expect through sociobiology is for humans to behave like other animals, where we are essentially sex machines trying to get as many of our genes as possible in subsequent generations. And so we would expect high levels of promiscuity, according to sociobiology. We do find that in some cultures, but for the most part, that seems to be fairly rare. Most cultures at least put a high level of emphasis on monogamy or some level of commitment to a single or a small number of mates. We would predict that morality would come from culture, according to human behavior. And this is, basically their morality, according to sociobiology, should not be something that we have, but it should be something that's forced upon us, right? Because there's no advantage in terms of fitness in behaving according to some governing laws that influence our behavior. And so it must be that if there's any instance of morality, it must be pushed by the culture, by our setting, and not actually by our own biological urges. And this one's interesting. You see that culture does have an enormous amount of power in humans, much more than you find in other animals. That our behavior is governed by our cultural development. We learn a lot of our behavior from watching others around us and from being influenced by the way others interact with us. Now, but what we do also find is there are some things that tend to transcend culture. And you see this a lot with missionaries noting this, that when they're, work for years or decades with a particular people group, and they're finally able to get down to what is considered right and wrong, that most cultures basically come to a very similar set of guidelines as to what is right and what is wrong, indicating that it transcends culture, that there's something about our moral behavior that is actually embedded into us. And that's really interesting. That's not exactly something you would expect from sociobiology. And so really what it gets down to is the jury's still out. I mean, there are some evidences that there's some human behaviors that are influenced by genetics. I'm sure you've either read a study or heard a reference to a study that, there are some genes that contribute to addictive behaviors. There are genes that contribute to aggressive behaviors. There are genes that contribute to, promiscuous behaviors. That being said, our programming of all organisms on Earth, our programming seems to be the closest to just do what's best for the organism and allowing a flexibility of different tactics and strategies. And so that the strategy is basically do what's best, and then you can do that in many different ways. And so humans seem to be very unique in our ability to overcome our genetic programming, and even to have maybe very little influence of our genetics on our behavior, even though there is evidence of some. And there's no doubt that culture influences our behavior a great deal. In humans, it's very clear that culture is a self-replicator like genes are. And what I mean by that is you have cultural, Richard Dawkins calls them memes rather than genes, these little cultural nuggets that tend to replicate themselves from one generation to the next. And so that could be a set of moral guidelines. It could be a set of things that you consider to be true. It could be a set of other things that influence your behavior, but they tend to pass on from generation to generation, and honestly have oftentimes a much larger impact than than genes passing on. And we'll talk more about that on Wednesday as well.